Our fellow teacher, Michelle Ferris, is back with us today to talk about how to overcome trauma triggers that negatively impact our relationships. Michelle is a licensed psychotherapist, anger management specialist, mother, author, course creator, and one day at a time activist. She loves helping codependent people create healthy relationships without sacrificing their big heart. In her private practice, she believes that it doesn't have to take years to heal your relationships. When you learn to trust yourself, you can create mutually satisfying connections that work. And she can often be found with a venti latte from Starbucks while working on her next course. Welcome back to AVAIYA, Michelle.
Thanks, Andy. So great to be here as usual.
As usual, always good to see you. And I'm so glad we got a great conversation lined up today, because I think triggers are something most of us can personally relate to, being triggered by things. So let's specifically talk first about what is a trauma trigger.
So it's basically an intense reaction to something that's happening in the present moment that actually is a reminder of the trauma. But the tricky part is that most people don't equate the two. So they think it's the present situation that's bothering them. So they're super focused on either changing what the situation is or blaming the other person for making them feel that way because it's so intense. But that is what creates problems, because if you don't recognize the trigger, then you're not going to be able to heal it. But one easy way to recognize the trigger is if your reaction is bigger than the situation, then you know it's a trigger.
That's good. I can think of, I'm like, oh, right. I remember being triggered a few days ago. Oh, that must've been something from, from childhood. Cause you make it into some like way bigger deal than it even makes sense to. So I can imagine, right? Like this is going to impact our relationships because if we're not resolved in our trauma from the past and we have a partner or a friend or a child or a neighbor or whoever, like, how do you see these triggers impacting us in our adult relationships?
So there's two ways specifically. One is we have a really hard time containing our emotions because, of course, we're going to be flooded at that point and get into that fight, flight, freeze, and now fawn response, right? So it's going to be much harder for us to manage conflict, to communicate without blame. It's just all that intensity is going to be really, really hard. The other way it affects us is the opposite, is people will shut down and just go, wow, I'm so flooded that I'm numb. And they will withdraw from the relationship, and then that creates separation. So the other person feels abandoned, feels left, feels like there's no connection anymore. So the other thing I think that happens a lot is that we, the people who are triggered or have the trauma, tend to get labeled, oh, we're being too sensitive. You know, you shouldn't react to that. I don't see what the big deal is. And that's because they don't understand that it's not just what the other person is doing or saying. It's really that they're tapping into that trauma. And if both people don't know it, then it's really, really hard to manage and come out of that.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. I'm so glad you said that, because so many people have experienced some kind of childhood trauma and then often, right, partner with someone else who has also experienced childhood trauma. So I can only, hold on a second. You can only imagine, right, when both of those sides are coming into a situation with each other, how a conflict must go in those scenarios.
Oh yeah, it erupts really quickly. And the problem is because it's so intense, both people think it's about the other person.
Yeah.
So it's, you made me feel this way. You just said I was stupid, when actually the other person never actually said that. But there was something implied that was the message that the other person got. So it's really hard if you can't label it, I'm triggered, because that alone is going to help you not go down that blame path.
Right. Absolutely. And so, okay, so let's go back to specifically childhood trauma. And, there's lots of different kinds of traumatic events we can all have experienced. Sometimes it's as an adult, we might get PTSD after a car accident or obviously veterans and, rapes and all sorts of terrible things. But what about childhood trauma specifically makes it so difficult to recover from?
So first, I love that you're naming trauma as a lot of different things, because some people I think can think, well, I didn't have a trauma, but really a trauma is any event that you find severely disturbing and you can't let go of. That really is how I define it. But so when we're children, we don't have the tools yet. So, I mean, as adults, if we experience a trauma, we probably have some coping skills. We can get support. We can go to therapy. We have more wherewithal to be able to figure out how to deal with that. But as kids, they have no idea. So they're left alone with it. And if they also don't feel like they can tell anybody, then all of those feelings get stuck and they literally hold that trauma in their body for years until it probably eventually shows itself in some destructive ways. So the child experiences the trauma, right, which alone is really difficult. But I think the other part that makes it so hard is if they do tell their parent or caregiver, and that caregiver does not validate that trauma and actually says to them something like, that didn't happen, you're wrong, that other person would never hurt you like that, and totally dismisses their experience, that to me is what does the most damage, because then the child is not only left with the trauma, they're left with, oh my God, my perception of the trauma isn't even right. It's not even good enough to get somebody to help me. Mm-hmm. So there's that implied helplessness that really creates a lot of loneliness and isolation and distrust. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that, that's why to me, it's like, if any parents are listening right now, the one thing you can give your child or any child is that validation that, yes, that happened to you. Yes, I believe you. Because then the child's going to go, oh my God, I'm believed. My experience is important and it was wrong. And this adult is actually going to take steps to protect me. That's what we want. Mm-hmm. But, a lot of us as kids didn't get that.
Yeah, like that whole thing you just said, I had such chills because it's so sad to me that experience. And I've known people that I personally I don't remember having an experience like that, but I've known people who have and haven't been validated. And absolutely, it's gut wrenching to think about what that's like for a kid. And then it links into, and we'll talk about this a little later, right? But self-trust. And if you can't, right, then you start not trusting yourself and going down a path of not even being able to trust your own anything, right? So that's just it's terrible. So let's go back to triggers for a minute here. So as adults, right? We're adults, we've experienced whatever kinds of traumas we've experienced as children. What are some common triggers you see in relationships?
So a big one is when we perceive somebody else is upset. That's where we can become hyper alert, like, something's going to happen. I could be hurt because someone else just has a tone of voice or that looks angry or has a grimace on their face. I mean, that's the one irony, is that when you've experienced trauma, you do become hyper aware of your surroundings to stay safe. And that can be a good thing because you're much more aware than the average person. But at the same time, we can misinterpret that. So that's a big one. Feeling like we're not being heard. I know that's a huge one in my couples work. When people don't feel heard, they get enraged sometimes because they, if they haven't been heard or validated as a kid, they're not going to let themselves experience that again. So that intensity and that intense defensiveness comes out because, they're done. They're like, I'm not going to not be heard again. Another one is feeling like you're not important. Maybe somebody leaves you out of a situation, and instead of realizing there might be other reasons for that, we take it to mean, oh my God, it's something wrong with me. They don't love me. They don't want me anymore. And these kind of triggers get really intense because there's a lot of assuming we're doing versus actually checking out, hey, why did this actually happen? But of course, when that trigger starts, it's really hard to separate the present from the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm so glad you mentioned the one about not being heard, because what immediately came to me when you said that is being misunderstood.